Britain's government wants sweeping new powers to monitor people's internet and phone use. It says it's needed to fight terrorism and crime in the 21st century, but opponents say it's going too far. An essential security tool or an unnecessary breach of personal freedoms? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, it's a plan for nationwide electronic surveillance that, if implemented, will track any message sent to anyone at any time. But this isn't Iran or China that's planning this, it's the United Kingdom. And if it happens, it could set a precedent for other countries. The so-called Snoopers Charter would force internet service providers to keep records of all email messages on social networking sites and conversations over Skype. Internet companies will have to install hardware to allow the government access to online communications. A court order will be required to listen to or read those communications, but the police and security services won't need one to demand who the communication is between and when it took place. It is a move British politicians say is needed to prevent terrorism and catch criminals. British Home Secretary Theresa May said such data has been used in every security service terrorism investigation and 95% of serious organised crime investigations over the last 10 years. We cannot afford to lose this vital law enforcement tool, she goes on to say, but currently online communication by criminals can't always be tracked. That's why the government is proposing to help the police stay one step ahead of the criminals. Former Conservative Shadow Home Secretary David Davis described the move as an unnecessary extension of the ability of the state to snoop on ordinary people. He said, historically, governments have been kept out of our private lives. Our freedom and privacy has been protected by using the courts, by saying, if you want to intercept, if you want to look at something, fine. If it is a terrorist or a criminal, go and ask a magistrate and you'll get your approval. You shouldn't go beyond that in a decent, civilised society. So, is the surveillance law in the UK necessary? Well, for more on this, we're joined by our guests in London. Bob Ayers, an international security analyst and former intelligence officer. Danvers Baillieu, a senior associate at Pinsent Masons and a specialist in internet law. Good to have you with us. Bob Ayers, if I could start with you, just talk us through how these new powers would work exactly when they're put into practice, and are they necessary?
Well, the first thing we have to bear in mind is we haven't seen the legislation yet. We've had a lot of discussion about it, a lot of leaks on it, but we haven't seen the details. But assuming the leaks are reasonably accurate, what the legislation is going to do is to enable the security services or the police to perform what is known as traffic analysis. By that I mean they will be able to identify what email addresses you've been writing email to. They'll be able to identify what websites you've logged onto, and they'll be able to identify what phone numbers you've called and the duration of the call. One of the things that we're told now that the new powers will not allow is allow the police or the security services to read the content of your communications without a court order signed by a magistrate. So is it needed? The security authorities think it is needed, but that's open for debate.
All right, Danvers Baillieu, talk us through some of the legal issues at work here, because one of the things that many people are concerned about is whether these new powers would enable the authorities to bypass any kind of judicial oversight.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's the main concern. It's an accepted fact that if the authorities want to get hold of certain information about you, or they want to put you under surveillance and so on, yes, that can happen in our democratic society, but you first must go and see a judge or a magistrate and get that signed off. So there's some sort of judicial oversight. The proposals being put forward are going to allow the state, and it's not just the security services and the police. The reports out have said something like 600 agencies are going to have access to this information, and they're going to be able to access this, so-called traffic data at will without asking permission of anybody, and that is what's upsetting so many people.
So is this going too far then? I mean, is this a case of too much Big Brother watching you?
I think so. I don't quite see what the justification is that people's, basically private information. I can't see any justification for accessing that private information without some sort of court order or some sort of process, basically.
Bob Ayers, what would the security services and the police be able to do with this sort of information once they get it? I mean, on a practical level, how does it further benefit their efforts to go after people that they suspect are criminals or engaging in terrorist activity?
Right. Well, let's assume that there is a website that has information on it that would be capable of teaching you how to build explosive devices, bombs, if you will. By watching the addresses of people that were logging onto that website, that would serve as a tripwire for the security services that perhaps there was a terrorist trying to learn how to make a bomb. They could then apply to the court for a warrant and actually read what the man was doing while he was at that website. It would also enable people to do something called link analysis. If I am calling you on the telephone and you are friends with a known terrorist, then the linkage from me to you to the known terrorist would enable the police to begin to investigate my sentiments. So what they're doing is they're trying to establish patterns of behavior, links to dangerous sites, or links to dangerous people.
Danvers Baillieu, as a lawyer, what kind of safeguards then you think should or could be put in place to ensure that any attempt to basically exploit this program, how could that be prevented?
Well, I don't have any trouble with the authorities tracking down terrorists. And I'm sure that if the security authorities wanted to monitor traffic going to a particular website, they could go and see a judge and get permission to do that. But the idea that they can do it without any oversight is what we're debating at the moment. And also there's this sort of, and I'm sure Bob doesn't think this, but the idea that terrorists just openly connect to the internet without using proxies and remote servers and that sort of thing to mask where they're coming from. I mean, that's quite a, it's a nice idea that they're easy to track down like that. But as anybody in this area knows, that any terrorist who is seriously trying to do harm to people, that they're going to be taking all sorts of countermeasures to hide their tracks. And this sort of law is just really not going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, Bob, Danvers brings up a point there that potential criminals or anyone engaging in this sort of suspect activity is generally smarter than this, and they will be savvy to this sort of thing. I mean, if they want to be able to bypass this sort of monitoring, they can do that, can't they?
Well, let's not overestimate the intelligence of the average criminal or the average terrorist. A lot of them are caught every day around the world because of poor communication security, slipshod use of the internet, slipshod use of telephones. So yes, some are very good, some are very clever, some use encryption and you could never read what they say anyway. But nevertheless, the fact remains that the state believes this is a tool to allow them to identify criminal or terrorist activity. And we talk about the data as if it's private, the addressing data. Well, the information on which websites I link to or what addresses I sent email to already resides with the internet service providers. They hold that information now. It's not private, it's not protected, it's out there in the public domain. The point is that the information is out there, it is available, the internet service providers can analyze that information any way they want. So it's not a matter of this information is suddenly going to be revealed to someone. It's already been revealed. The question is, are we going to expand that revelation of information to include government agencies as well as the internet service providers?
Go ahead, Danvers.
Well, most internet service providers are going to have something in their terms and conditions that say they're not going to be actually tracking what you do and just sort of dipping in just to have a look at what one of their customers happens to have been browsing that day. They will be treating that information privately, and in fact at the moment when the authorities go and get a warrant to get hold of information from one of the big ISPs, the information that gets extracted from the database won't even be revealed to the ISP themselves. So Bob, I don't disagree that the ISPs are obviously holding that information, but it'd be wrong to say that they're actively monitoring it or looking at it. There's obviously active monitoring going on for particularly harmful sites and sites that are holding, illegal content and so on. But a lot of those sites are blocked in any event. But at the end of the day, it is still treated as somebody's private information. It's a bit like saying the post office should be allowed to sort of open your letters before you receive them to find out who's been writing to you.
No, but the post office can certainly read the address that you're sending the letter to.
It can, but it doesn't, for example, open the envelope and find out who sent the letter. And they're not collecting that information in any sort of organised fashion.
The legislation that we're discussing right now does not afford the government the opportunity to look at the content of the communications. It's just like a letter in the post office. You've got an address on the letter where you're sending it. You've got a return address, which is you. And the postman can look at that. That's exactly what happens when you're sending an email. You have an address it's going to, an address it's coming from. And why is the electronic version of that something that the government should not be allowed to see, but a paper copy of the communication is perfectly available to the government to see and perfectly legal? And as a matter of fact, the government can't do their job without looking at it.
Danvers, you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, Bob, that assumes that everybody sticks their address on the back of an envelope, which is not always the case as a return address. But so immediately, I'm just suggesting the letter would have to be opened to find out, who it was from. And if the legislation was framed in that way and people thought their privacy was being invaded, sort of in a physical sense like that, then I think there would be an even bigger outcry. I think we're going to see a huge outcry about this legislation, and already the reports in the papers, I think it started on Sunday, has already provoked quite a strong backlash from the sort of those in the coalition parties who care about civil liberties, and so I'm not very confident that we're going to see this on the statute book, or maybe it may even be dropped from the Queen's
Danvers,
speech.
if I could put this to you, if there is a strong security argument here in certain cases, shouldn't that override any of the moral arguments about invasion of privacy?
But you can make a strong security argument for torture. You can make a strong security argument for all sorts of things that we don't do. So a strong security argument on its own is not enough. What we have at the moment is a perfectly good system which says where the security services have a specific person they want to look at or a specific issue they want to investigate, they go and see a judge, they make the case, and more often than not these things get signed off. There's not these requests aren't made particularly publicly. There's not a lot of scrutiny on the sort of requests that get made at the moment, and they're not difficult for the security forces to make. And they can do exactly that, and it works. The current legislation does away with that oversight, and B, it expands the number of agencies, but by a huge number, includes local councils and so on. It's the same sort of legislation that led to local councils putting trackers in people's bins to make sure that they were throwing away the right sort of rubbish, which people decided that, yeah, fine, that they can do that to detect a crime, but it's a complete overreaction to sort of minor matters. And the problem is, if you give authorities these sorts of powers, they tend to use them for purposes they weren't originally designed to use, and they tend to be abused.
All right, we're going to talk about some of the international comparisons that the critics of this have made here. Opponents of the proposed plan, as you may have heard, have compared the UK plan to the policies of tightly controlled states like China and Iran, the very same states that the UK has heavily criticised for their restrictive web controls. In China, Facebook, Twitter and YouTube are banned and the internet is monitored. Last year, Google closed its China-based search engine after certain requests were banned. Iran has long censored the internet, blocking access to international news sites and forums for dissidents. And as parliamentary elections approached in March, control over the internet tightened further. Now, we're not suggesting that the UK government, that if you live in the UK, pretty soon you're not going to be able to access things like Facebook and Twitter and Google and so on. But Bob Ayers, isn't this a dangerous path? If these laws are implemented, does the British government, will they now still have the moral high ground to take aim at countries like China and Iran?
I guess it would depend on what you do with the information and how you deal with the information you've collected. If the information you've collected is for a specific purpose, such as identify pedophiles or to identify terrorists, then I think there's an overriding interest in the state for doing that. If the information is being collected so as the state can then oppress its citizenry, of course that's wrong. We have censorship in many other areas in the UK. What you can say in public is censored. What you can write down is censored. And suddenly, when we're talking about this electronic world called the internet, we have this terrible reaction to the thought that the government might somehow interfere with, control, or manage what people are doing on it. And I'm not sure that that's a legitimate concern.
Danvers, what's your view on that?
I can't say I disagree strongly there with Bob. I mean, the point is that the authorities have got to keep law and order, and they maintain the rule of law, and they do need certain powers to do it. And as Bob said, it really depends on how they exercise those powers at the end of the day. All countries are going to have certain restrictions on material that's available to the public, whether it be by the internet or in printed matter. And it's all, it's a relative, it's all relative basically. China is going to be still a lot more restrictive, and still would be even if we implemented these current proposals. So. I don't think there's an issue here about losing the moral high ground.
All right, well, we're joined now by Adrian Mars, also in London. He is a tech and internet analyst. Adrian, thanks for being with us. Could I ask you the same question that we've been asking at the beginning of this program? Is this, in your opinion, an unnecessary extension of the ability of the state to basically snoop on people?
I think it is. Of course, it's hard to say exactly how beneficial it is, but it's fairly easy to see the downsides. And of course, the more surveillance you have, the less crime you have. But it's a balance between living in a police state. We could live in a state where everything we do is watched, and indeed various states attempt that, like North Korea and the Soviet Union. But it's an extremely unpleasant place to be. So really the question is, where should the balance be? And it's very hard to see a justification that says it's right to go to the courts to see the contents of a message, but you don't need to see who you're talking to or which webpage you're visiting. And that's very personal. Who all of your contacts are is deeply personal information, as is the web pages you're visiting. It's not just the website, it's the exact page. So that includes mapping data, which is where you're going. Most people look that up, and they're navigating on their phones. All of that would be stored. It's who they're talking to, it's what they're interested in. It's moment to moment, almost, in many cases, what people are thinking. Whenever I watch TV or read a book, I usually have the internet next to me. I Google any questions that pop into my head. Now, I really don't want to share that with the government. So secondly, the number of false positives is likely to rise enormously when you're trawling this sort of data. For the example Bob gave, for example, if your friend has a friend who is suspicious, then that might raise suspicions about you. But that pulls in an enormous number of people. An enormous number of those will quite inadvertently trigger other triggers. So they might have been in a certain area or made a certain Google search, or, as he said, quite innocently have been on a website that has maybe, Al-Qaeda videos. A lot of people would look at them and be absolutely opposed to what they're seeing. But they see that mentioned on TV, they'll go and look at it. Now, the more you do this, of course, and the bigger the database, the more information is in it, the more false positives you get. And in fact, in the end, the more time you waste of the security services chasing these things. America actually tried this shortly after 9/11. They started building big databases and what's called data mining, looking for unexpected links. And it produced tens of thousands of cases to investigate and zero arrests, absolutely zero. It was over 30,000 investigations.
I want to ask you as well, Adrian, sorry to interrupt. Are you concerned as well that this has the potential to be abused, that monitoring under the guise of national security could be expanded to perhaps spy on political opponents and critics?
It's almost inevitable. I mean, that's what all governments do. Sometimes for very morally legitimate reasons, even when we're spying on our friends, and sometimes more questionable. But there's no oversight to this, and it's an obvious temptation. So whenever people who don't have oversight have this sort of enormous power, it's not really a question of will it happen, it's an absolute inevitability. And we've seen lots of miscarriages of justice over, basically unscrutinised bodies. We've seen extraordinary rendition, we've seen innocent people end up in Guantanamo Bay. As soon as you reduce the controls, the number of innocent people who get caught, as well as quite, legitimately, the number of terrorists who get caught also goes up. But balancing this, do you want to live in a world where you're at more fear from the authorities than you are from the very small risk of terrorism that we all live with?
Bob Ayers, if I could turn back to you on this and ask you, none of this is an exact science when you're monitoring potential criminals and terrorists. There is always a chance that the wrong person could be identified as a result of snooping on things like emails and phone calls and so on. What happens then?
Well, there's always mistakes that are going to be made, but what you have to consider is that this power that is being sought by the government isn't going to be used by a metropolitan policeman sitting in a little room watching a screen all day to see who you're talking to. What's going to happen is there's going to be computer analysis of the activity patterns, and there will be thresholds established, and when those thresholds are exceeded, it will call someone's attention to it to take a closer look. If you will, this is a tripwire effect.
But Bob, this is exactly what they tried in the States and abandoned. Data mining it produces enormous numbers of false positives, enormous numbers.
Well, I served for 30 years as an intelligence officer in the States, and let me tell you something. Data mining is still being done. It was done during those 30 years. It's not anything new. It does work. You just have to know how to manage the results of it. Now, one thing I find very interesting in the conversation thus far is we're all terribly concerned about the state abusing its power. Well, the state is now coming to the parliament to say, I want to pass legislation to allow me to do this. We don't trust them to behave in an honorable way, and yet we trust them to not do it without legislation. It's illogical. If the state wants to surveil people like this, they can do it whether they have legislation or not. So what we should consider is putting in place legislation that will allow us to know openly what the state is doing, establish requisite controls over that activity, and try to mitigate any potential damages that result from it.
All right, I want to give just in the couple of minutes that we have left, I want to give Adrian the last word on this, and we're talking about legal controls here. If someone is wrongly identified as a potential suspect, what legal recourse does he have here?
Well, at the moment, very little, because often that person won't know there's any surveillance on them. The whole point about this sort of surveillance is it's usually covert. So the argument is that you should be able to go to a commissioner to say, I think I've been watched unfairly. But chances are you'll never know, quite possibly until you're dragged off to a foreign jail or you wind up in court. And of course, even if at that point you manage to persuade people of your innocence, your life will have been turned upside down just by being investigated, just by facing prosecution. And of course, the people who do try and avoid these things are also likely to put more innocent people in the way. A common approach, for example, is to hide your tracks, is to break into a computer and use that computer to break into another computer. We are going to have to leave it there because unfortunately we are out of time. But a very lively discussion. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being with us. Bob Ayers, Danvers Baillieu and Adrian Mars. Many thanks for your time. That's it for this edition of Inside Story. And a reminder, if you want to send us your feedback, you can just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.